Sachin Chheda is the executive director of the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. I've known him for a while, and then when I saw this title change, I thought, what does that mean? What does that mean? So I did a little research and I thought, this is interesting. Like, wait a minute, I know you from a different world, in a different realm of influence, a very significant influence. And now you're switching up and doing something different, which I always think is interesting when people are shaping their careers and you've done well. You've kind of made it, right? And then you switched up on it. So thank you for agreeing to do this.
Thanks so much for having me this morning. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, welcome, Sachin. Okay, so when I first started to put together your bio for this session, there was a article about you that said that you were an influence and a behind the scenes mover and shaker and decision maker. What about those kind of titles? I mean, that's not uncommon verbiage for someone who has worked in public policy or been around politicians. Like, that's not, I wasn't shocked to see it, but people don't always get that label, and it actually is true, because for you it has been very true. You've worked on very significant campaigns and with super high level people. What does it feel like, though, when people say you're an influencer and a mover and shaker? Like, what does that feel like?
The word means something so different now, right? Because people identify themselves as influencers, and it's a social media term. And I think when I first tried to use that word or heard that word, it was about like political influence, right? And it wasn't about kind of the consumer side or being on TikTok or anything like that. But you know, I think I spent a lot of time and more. I mean, even now in the role as executive director, it's about supporting elected leaders, right? And so whether I was working on a campaign or I was working in government, and kind of went back and forth, and now have returned to government, but in support of an elected leader who is driving forward a vision that voters have endorsed, right? And so I spent a lot of time, almost 20 years, just really focused on helping candidates tell that story to the public, or helping issue advocates tell the story of how to get their issue done inside of government, usually. And so, you know, to have been out of government for 17 years and to come back and to actually, you know, try to lead an organization and to help that leader, that elected leader, in my case, it's State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Jill Underly, you know, be successful. We have a lot of challenges in education. And I realized after a long time of supporting candidates on the getting elected side that, you know, I wasn't doing as much in helping them actually do the job they're getting
Once
elected
they're
to,
in,
right?
yeah.
And so as I thought about kind of what is my, you know, you went through early stage career and then mid stage career, and now I'm really thinking about, you know, I'd like to retire in 10 years. So what does that last decade look like? And so I decided I wanted to try to dig in somewhere, and this ended up being the best fit. So
there's a lot of people listening. I mean, every time I've done a session like this, we do these mentorship mornings, and we have another program called the Leadership Luncheons. And it's very similar to this. It's the career story, their leadership journey. And people are always curious about, especially young professionals, I think sometimes have an insecurity about not being where they envisioned, or not starting in the place that they thought they were going to start, or thinking that the life has to take a certain path, the career have to take a certain path, or else you're doing something wrong. That changes as we get older, because I think we all know twists and turns are just part of the journey. But for the people listening, for the benefit of them, let's go all the way back. Let's talk about where you grew up, what that was like, what you were like.
I mean, I was a goofball. I am the only child of Indian immigrants who came to the Midwest mostly. We moved around a bunch, but then we settled in New Berlin. So I was in the suburbs of Milwaukee. I went to Eisenhower, go Lions. And I'm actually going back there on Monday with Superintendent Underly to review and see their career and technical education program. So that's actually kind of exciting that I'm going to it's my school. We had another colleague who graduated from Platteville and went with Dr. Underly to Platteville High School on this past Monday night. And so we love to find to kind of do that, right? I was, look, I was a spoiled child of Asian immigrants. I was not studious, but I was fairly smart. So it was kind of like, until you get to middle of high school, you can coast,
Yeah.
right? And then I had not built the good habits of being a good student. So I kind of got through high school, started college. And then what I always tell people I became like a campus activist, a student activist. I was involved in student organizations and student government and working on things. And then I just never grew up. And that ended up being my career. And I learned things in classes, and I'm glad I went to school. I switched majors a couple times. But it was really the experience outside the classroom in the college environment that shaped all the things that I still use. And really, I would never compare myself to him, but I was a community organizer. I was an organizer, right? First on campus, then in politics, then in the community. And then I did a little work in journalism, and I didn't have a plan. You always have like an idea that like, oh, I want to do this thing, but there was no plan. I know if somebody had said, oh, you're going to be running the state education agency or working at the state education agency when you're 50, like I would have been like, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? So, and I think that's okay. I think if you're someone who is like, I'm just going to get a job, I'm going to work for 30 or 40 or 50 years, I'm going to retire. That wasn't an uncommon strategy. It's like, that's what my father-in-law did. In the mid-century, mid-20th century. I think that's much less common now because it's hard to find even blue collar jobs that are going to last for that long time. I think the trades are an exception to that. That the trade, Billy Evangelists here, that like you still can kind of make that career. But even I see a lot of folks in the trades, and my oldest is just became a union machinist, and maybe that's what he'll do for the next 40 years, and maybe it's not what he'll do for the next 40 years. I don't know. So you can go to college and you can say, I'm going to study this thing. I'm going to study accounting. I'm going to study marketing. I'm going to become a teacher. That doesn't mean that's what you're going to spend your whole career doing.
What was your first, you switched majors a couple times? What were they?
Well, I like to go back and say when I was 7 years old, people asked me what I was going to be. And I said, I'm going to be a carpenter and a carpenter. And I think I just liked how those two words sounded together because somebody had come in and they'd help redo our basement. And, in the 80s, you put carpet in your basement. I don't know why anyone would ever do that, but that's what
right.
And so they, built paneling and flooring and carpeting. And so I was like, oh, I'll do that. In college, I started as a journalism major. And then I ended up realizing that my interest was in politics. So I became a political science major, although that political science is really, it's a science, right? It's the study of politics. It's not really the practice of politics. Yeah. So then eventually I became a history major because that's what I was trying to apply things. And then the chancellor at UWM hired me and I didn't graduate. So I say that and she gets very sad. It's Nancy Jimfair, who is now retired from running the State University of New York. And it was not my fault. Don't blame me.
So you're at school, you're finding your way. I mean, you got a general idea. You were figuring out your passions. That was clear.
Figuring out my passions for sure.
You get involved on campus. Did somebody like pull you into a program?
So at first I was in an organization that so Earth Day started in Wisconsin. And on the 20th anniversary of Earth Day, which was now almost 35 years ago, there was a big fair, a big concert, and there were booths where I signed up at an organization. They called me. This was pre-cell phone era, so they'd call you in a landline, and then you'd drive there. You couldn't talk to anybody in the half an hour drive, right? And I came to some place called the Peace Action Center in River West, and that was kind of the first place that I got involved. There was a war. I got involved in the activity against the war. That connected me to some people who were in student government, so I got involved in student government. That connected to people in the College Democrats, so I got involved in College Democrats and campaigns. I worked on a few different issues, including some international human rights stuff, and just was in organizations on campus. And then I would get a job working on a campaign, and I'd leave school for 6 months or a year and a half, and then I'd come back. And eventually kind of landed in realizing that helping leaders succeed was kind of what I was good at. So I did that for Chancellor, I did that for Congressman Baldwin, I did that for now Senator Baldwin, I did that for Governor Doyle. And then after I'd been doing that, and then, I've been in my kind of professional career for more than a decade, I was like, okay, now I know enough. I can try to be a consultant. And I didn't want to be in government anymore after I'd been in government and I'd been at the state. And so, and then after 17 years of being outside of government, I'm like, grass is greener, and now I've gone back. So
Are you hesitant of change? Like, do you do it because it's necessary, or are you like excited about change?
I don't know that I'm that philosophical about it,
Okay.
right? That it just, at any given moment, you deal with the choices that are presented in front of you. When I was, I was Mayor Johnson's political director. Our firm was also working with County Executive Crowley. That firm still does. Helped a lot of people get elected. And frankly, this was like last spring, last summer, I was looking ahead and I was saying, I'm not really doing anything new. I was working with a lot of elected officials who were in really strong positions.
Mhm.
It was not clear that either Mayor Johnson or County Executive Crowley would have an opponent. They basically, they have token opposition on the ballot, people who've gotten on the ballot, but they're not real strong candidates. All the other candidates we're working with, it didn't seem like there were going to be a lot of competitive races. And I was doing things like editing emails, which is what I'd done 20 years earlier, right? And I was like, you can help these folks, but at some level, I was treading water a little bit. And in middle age, you're like, what's my retirement plan? I was on the exchange, which I'm very glad that the exchange exists and there's some subsidy, and Obamacare has done a great job to make healthcare better, but it was still pretty expensive. I mean, I made a decent salary, and so it was still pretty expensive. And so I started to think about what is my last stage of career looks like.
Yeah.
And I said, I've got health insurance that I get to deal still with kids who are in school. I've got to think about my retirement. I want that challenge of digging in a little bit deeper and doing something a little harder. And I want to be at that leadership level. And so in talking to people that I'd helped elect and people I hadn't helped elect and looking around, I was looking for that leadership opportunity. And so to become executive director of the state education agency, it was an opportunity that I couldn't pass up, and it was a good fit.
So you had already decided that it was time to move on, and then the opportunity presented itself?
Yeah, and I did some traveling. I mean, I was lucky in that, I was able to, I knew I needed to leave not too late in the year because these campaigns were coming up. There's a spring election, et cetera. And my political career, I've done a lot of fall races, but I've done a lot more in spring races. So kind of nonpartisan Wisconsin, local and state races. And so I was thinking about that. So I left I think it was at the end of July, did some traveling, went to India, was in these conversations with people, and then kind of came back and settled into what the plan was. And then, it's the state, so it took a couple of months for things to all fall into place because there's bureaucracy, which I'm now in charge of the bureaucracy to some degree. It's kind of fun. I got to send an email yesterday where I'm like, we're going to smash the bureaucracy.
Nice. What is it? You've been in the position how long now?
I've been in the position for 3 months. I started technically at the beginning of November. Yeah.
So you're in this adjustment period because it takes what do they say? It takes a year before you even. So what are you learning about yourself in these 3 months?
I'm definitely learning. I'm relearning patience, right? So that when you are working on a campaign and the campaign is 6 weeks or 10 weeks or 20 weeks away, patience is not a virtue. You just have to get things done, right? But when you're in a large government organization, and people are there, a lot of people are there, for long careers or for life, right? That's the thing. The pace of progress is not always compatible with immediate change. Because I work, directly for an elected superintendent, she's been in that position for about 2.5 years. She has a year to go before she would be reelected or not, right, in next spring. And so she definitely understands that she has a limited term, right? But there are only, I think, 7 appointed people. And then there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in civil service or in career positions. And that tension is always, it's interesting and I'm sure that's true for the mayor, that's true for county executive, that's true for the governor, right? Where there are a handful of people really at the top level of leadership who can change on a dime, but everybody else is kind of there to do that job. They do a phenomenal job. They do a hard job. We have a robust public education system, three different kind of systems between choice and charter and public. There's a lot of federal regulation. There's a lot of federal money and state money and local money, and there's a lot of work that has to be done to help improve outcomes for kids. I have to show some patience. Now, I'm not going to show like we have 10 years to solve problems, right? But sometimes we can't solve problems in a week.
Tell us what the job is, like, what are you looking at?
So my specific role is, my biggest title is Executive Director of the Office of State Superintendent. There are three other people on the executive leadership team, along with the elected superintendents. The five of us are kind of executive leadership. There's a cabinet of about 15 people. And then there's a directors and assistant directors group, which is a few dozen people. So kind of layers of leadership. I oversee our communications portfolio. I oversee the legal portfolio. I run the actual administrative office of the state superintendent. So that's things like her schedule and making sure that other leadership are out doing events, telling the story of what they're doing. And then being part of the strategic decision-making team around, taking positions on legislation and policy, making sure that we're effectuating that policy well. Right now, we are in a really big initiative where working with the legislature and the governor, we passed new literacy standards and really are trying to address achievement by helping kids learn to read so that they can read to learn. We haven't done as well as that on that as I guess historically Wisconsin's done in the last 10 or 15, 20 years. So we're really changing that. We're initiating new standards, insisting upon new curriculum. There's a push and pull with local control in Wisconsin because we really do have a locally controlled system of education. And so that work has to be done. There's a politically appointed council that's helping provide advice. And then we have to actually implement this law. It's called Act 20. And every day there's something happening to try to move that ball forward, whether it's vendors providing curriculum information or it's interest groups saying, we want it to go like this or we want it to go like that. And, the actual devil's always in the details on things like that. Like the legislature passed a law, but now you actually have to implement it. So that's a big thing the agency's dealing with. We know that absenteeism is a big post-pandemic challenge, not just in schools, but actually, I guess you might all know that out in the real world, workforce challenges are very new. It's a different culture, I think, out there. The expectation, obviously, COVID, we're expecting people not to come to work. We have a lot of hybrid environments like this event. And so all those things are new and challenging. Kids' mental health coming out of the pandemic has been a real focus of attention. And the fight around equity and inclusion, that like kids can't learn if they don't feel like they belong in a classroom. And I think we have made a ton of progress on that front in this state and across the country. And now that fight has become politicized. People are trying to make schools and libraries battlefields. Schools and libraries shouldn't be battlefields. We just want kids to learn. It's incredibly interesting to me that when I talk to folks in corporate America, they're like, it's just good business to include everybody. We want every customer. We want every worker. But why wouldn't we do this? Even the most conservative Republicans to the most progressive Democrats kind of agree on that. And then yet there's this political fight that's very disconnected from all of our realities in schools and libraries and in the business community. So those are the kinds of things I'm dealing with every day.
So, what does the team look? Because that's a lot. Like, you're not able to.
No,
what does the team look like?
I've got great colleagues. So there's a superintendent, there's a deputy superintendent, there's an associate deputy superintendent. I'm the executive director of the Office of State Superintendent, and then there's an executive director specifically for equity and inclusion. And so that person actually not only runs human resources and equity and inclusion initiatives, but also then makes sure that that inclusion dynamic is included in everything. So there's a kind of down and across that Dimitri runs. And so that 5-person executive leadership team, we've got a great cabinet of directors and assistant superintendents and people running programs, and then a fantastic crew of directors and assistant directors who actually run programs. So we have a very, you have to build organizations, right? I'm coming into that. I haven't helped build any of that. I've been there. I'm the newest person kind of in that environment. But they've done a good job of that. And obviously, Wisconsin's had public education at some level longer than everybody else, right? We had the first kindergartens. We built a robust expectation of public education all the way back to our state constitution. And so that system has been built. It's just about now dealing with the challenges of today, which are different and unique. We have a superintendent who was elected literally during the pandemic. We were talking yesterday, and it's like when we first started working together, we didn't even meet in person right away, right? Because this was in, I don't know if it was late 2020 or early 2021, but it was still a very virtual world at that point. And so, and even now the agency, and it was moving this way anyway for practical reasons, but it is almost an entirely virtual agency. We went from 3 floors of office space, we've collapsed to 1 floor. On any given day, I'd say, I don't know, 10, 15, 20% of the workforce is actually in the building. There are tons of people who are 100% virtual. Everything is run on Microsoft Teams. And it's an interesting dynamic. So, yeah. Me too. I'm learning.
There are people who are parents, like I'm sitting here thinking about my kids go to Golda.
Okay.
And their dad a lot more involved on the sports side than I am, which has been helpful because I'm virtually attending the PTA things usually. But I'm often thinking about how to be more supportive of them, the school, the teachers. And when we think about some of the challenges that we're facing in public education, I feel a little overwhelmed and like under-equipped to help. And I know even if you have kids or you don't have kids, I think people are like, how do we help? How do we support? What would be your best advice around where we even start with that conversation?
And you're asking specifically about parents and workers?
I would say parents, and there's a lot of just professionals that are like on this call, don't have kids. Mm-hmm. Never want kids, care about Milwaukee.
Right.
It's like that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, here's what I'll say. Parental engagement and adult engagement with kids is one of the top indicators of success. And success is defined broadly. And that could be, test score achievement. It could be success in the classroom. It could be learning to write, which is absolutely critical. It could be just finding your path and finding your passion. And, there's people who might never be a good writer, but they're a phenomenal musician, or they're, good at sports, or they can express themselves through art or whatever it might be. And all of those things can lead to, career. They can lead to success in life. I think about this question in the context of like the contrast and the expectation of what we had in this country when it was for the white middle class. It was primarily a single earner kind of expectation. And I think there was a lot of intentionality in building the economy, specifically mostly for white people, but like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, that whatever you did, whether it was a highly educated career or it was you just came out of high school and worked in a factory or whatever it was, that the expectation was one income, right?
Yes.
And that was never true for people of color. It was never really true for kind of the lowest income folks. Like, always had to be kind of dual income. Yep. But that kind of ideal was built for a majority of the country, for a big chunk of the country, right? When wages in most industries didn't keep up with growth and didn't keep up with productivity, kind of post the 70s and into the 80s and 90s, that turned into the expectation of kind of dual income. And we created this expectation that if you had kids, you had to have childcare, and the public schools kind of played that role for school age kids and so on. So we really changed kind of the cultural expectations. For some kids can thrive, right? Like in that environment. My kids went to childcare. They went to really good childcare, and they thrived in that environment, right? And they were able to make friends, and they were able to learn, and they were able to succeed and do in whatever it is they're going to do. But that isn't true kind of for every kid. And so I think every child needs to have not just one, but multiple adults who are willing to engage with them. And sometimes that can be parents. if you have a single parent who's got 2 jobs and 3 kids, like that's really hard. And so then they need support. And so if you don't have kids, whether it's through formal programs like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, or getting involved in the Boys and Girls Club, that's great, but also just informally, right? Building those larger parental networks. I mean, It Takes a Village was the big, that Hillary Clinton wrote that book, but took it from an African proverb. That's really true. And even in my very middle class city of Milwaukee neighborhood, where we have a few families that are single income, but mostly still dual income, we could not succeed if we did not have neighbors picking up the kids sometimes at school, or watching them after school, or taking them, or just that. I mean, those of you who are parents know that sleepovers can be a godsend because it's like a free night, right? It's like to get stuff done. Usually, sometimes it's for joyful things, but sometimes just to get stuff done. But I think that parental and adult engagement is kind of really, really critical. And I think there aren't any government or formal structures for that, right? It's like there's an expectation of parental engagement. In schools, it's like, you can see the correlation. The higher income you are, the more likely it is to happen. If you have, the more educated you are, the more likely it is to happen. But we need it from everybody, right? And so I think that we need to do, as a state, I'm not sure that it's the agency's responsibility, but as a state, we need to do a better job of supporting every child, and making sure that they're on a path to be successful, however we define that. And I think that's the biggest thing.
And we got to start supporting the nonprofits that are responsible for doing that work. And I think sometimes we underestimate how important it is to kind of engage. We're engaging with kids through, Secure Futures and all these different nonprofits. If you're on virtually and you work with one of the nonprofits or volunteer, just drop them in the chat so people can have some ideas to what to look into. But I've seen that with my own kids, like because I grew up really poor, and luckily I didn't know I was poor. But I went to like Golden Meyer and went to Morris Middle School, and I went to King, and I had so much interaction with adults. But even with that, I still remember when I was younger, when I interacted with adults, I was a little shy and I didn't talk as much, and maybe would put, I would look down at the ground a little bit. When I started working here, I would interact with the CEO's kids. And I remember the first couple of times I would be surprised at how confident even the youngest kids were, and how comfortable they were interacting with me as an adult. Because I remember as a kid, I would always be a little hesitant to interact with an adult. I wasn't comfortable. I was just being polite. And I brought my kids in here the other day, and my son met the new president of the chamber, who is like 6'7".
He's 8'1". I looked it up.
He's the tallest person I've ever seen in person. When I first walked out, it's tallest person. Yeah. He looks at his feet and he looks all the way up his body and says, his kids, your kids are walking with you. You see them, and you see as a person. So I just kind of like standing back and watching him interact with that. He said, "How did you get this tall?" I said, "Listening to my mother," and stuff like that. So I purposely didn't say anything because I just wanted to stand back and watch the person that this child is. And he's like confident, and he knows who he is, and he's funny, and I'm thinking, I didn't do that by myself.
You had a lot to do with that. But
I had a lot to do with it, but like he knows how to fist bump dudes. It's like it's really such an impact in all these people around both my kids.
Look, here's what I'll say. I think every kid is capable of that. Every human child is capable of that. And I think, unfortunately, what has happened, it doesn't happen in our families, but it happens in our politics and in our public life, is that we just write off chunks of kids. And I think this is why we want when we talk about every kid, or we talk about inclusion and belonging, we have to meet those kids where they are. We have to deal with their life experiences, and we have to give them opportunities. And what we can't do is say, well, let's take this chunk of kids and give them the opportunity to succeed and let's just write off these kids. So I am, we have a very robust education system. We have a public system. We in Milwaukee have a very robust voucher and choice system that supports private kids in private schools. We have a charter system. We want every single one of those schools to do right by every single one of those kids. And I think, I'll tell you one thing I struggle with, and there's probably people who live in the city like you and I do here, and there's probably people who live in the suburbs here. And this is not a personal criticism of any family, but I always cringe a little bit when I hear people say, well, I moved somewhere for the schools, because I want every school to be somewhere that you're willing to live, right? And my kids have all gone to MPS and frankly, there's things that have been good about that. There's things that have been not great about that. And there's definitely opportunities that I know they've missed out on that come from us choosing not to live in Shorewood or Whitefish Bay or Tosa or Brookfield or wherever, all of which we could have made the choice. That I grew up in the suburbs, but it's not what we wanted for our neighborhood, but it's also not what we wanted for their experience, right? And so I think that we need to find a way that like, it's not just the kids at Golda and King and Reagan.
Right.
My kids, two of them went to Golda, three of them have gone to King, and the fourth one we'll see. But I want every kid at every school, Vincent, Juneau, Marshall, right, Obama, all of them need to have the expectation that we can meet the needs of those kids. Right now, we're not doing that, right? We're not setting the cultural expectation in our community that every kid is going to succeed. We're just writing kids off. We're saying, well, if your parents sent you here, or you live here, or whatever, you come from this place of poverty or whatever it is, that's the expectation. And obviously I think there's a racial component to that, but there's also just a deeper cultural component to that. There's a deeper expectation of who will have success and be able to do what they want in life, and who knows? We're just whatever's gonna happen. Sometimes that's really tough, like down at the classroom level, right? Because there are some kids who are more disruptive than other kids, right? And then you have to like figure out how to meet their needs. But we as a state have not made the investments that it takes. We actually know academically how to do that. We know how to serve every child. We know how to do it. But it is not free. It takes an incredible amount of resources. And the state funds 30% of special education needs right now. And we proposed 60%, doubling that. That would cost, I don't know, $1 billion a year. We've got it. The state's sitting on somewhere, depending on how you measure it, $4 to $7 billion surplus. We could do it. We have to make the political choice to do it. And I think that shouldn't be political. I don't think that should be partisan. And I think historically it hadn't been, right? If you look at, obviously there were political fights with Tommy Thompson, but the underlying support of putting money into schools and the university, that was there, right? And that was that we fought about other things, right? Now we fight about fundamental things, and whether or not there should be more investment in public school. And I think that is really, it's a really challenging time on that way, because we can actually serve every child. We know how to do it. We just have to make the decision as a society that we want to do that.
So what's the process to have that extra billion?
Well,
like what do we have to do to make that happen?
I think what I have seen is it is possible to have bipartisan agreement in this state. It's possible to do it. It's pretty rare. We're in and that's not just Wisconsin. It's American politics is pretty close to broken. But it is possible. And I think the literacy bill is an example of that, right? Where we really did have the Republican legislature, a Democratic governor, a Democratic state superintendent come together, work together behind the scenes, trying to work from science, trying to work from data, not just political ideology, and come up with a solution that is going to improve how many kids learn to read at a young age so that they can read to learn going forward. Like that is the goal. And it is still, even today, there's always push and pull, a bipartisan goal in Wisconsin. So we've just got to come to the place where we agree that that's the thing we're not going to fight about, right? And so I think if you look at, MMAC is there's a very bipartisan organization. There are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are conservatives, moderates, independents, liberals, everything is in this organization. And I think leadership, I would give leadership credit. I'd give Dale credit, who's someone I didn't support when he was an elected leader, but he is, he doesn't say he's the Republican head of the MMAC, right? And he's very supportive of the county executive and the mayor and their progressive Democrats, but he's also got relationships, across the aisle. I think that people like him organizations like MMAC, folks like all of you who are coming from different places. I heard, nonprofit nutrition, I heard hedge fund, I heard, like all the different things. If you guys come together and can find agreement that we should take those things off the political fight and just find solutions, right? Investing in education and have a political fight about other things, that would make a big difference. And it's where we can find, it's what the playing field is for politics that has changed so radically in Wisconsin. Because again, there never really was deep philosophical disagreement that we needed to have the best public university system in the country. And that was the bipartisan thing that regents of both parties, governors of both parties, legislatures of both parties invested in for over 100 years. And that changed. There was a moment that changed, right? And we need to get back to that for the university and K-12. I think we should get back to that for paving the roads, because that also was something we had bipartisan agreement on for a long time. And then, have the political fight about other things.
We got about 15 minutes left together, so I'm going to open it up to everyone virtual. If you have a question, go ahead and put it in the chat. So Sophie, let me know if you see questions coming through and questions in the room.
What kind of things are you recommending to promote equity, inclusion, and belonging in our schools? Any initiatives to promote early childhood education, such as Head Start or 2- and 3-year-old kindergarten?
Okay. I hear those kind of two different questions. I have not yet. I still have the excuse of being new in that I am 3 months into this job. And I was just in a meeting yesterday where I'm like, I need to get up to on our early childhood. It's not something I'm an expert on, other than I've had kids in early childhood programs. The obvious thing is that you cannot send kids to school at the ages of 4 or 5 if they don't have a background in that birth to 3 kind of range. So we have to have, where parents can give kids or where caretakers, guardians can give kids those tools, birth to 3 at home, great. Where they can't, we need to make sure we're filling that breach, because it's not that child's fault, and that to me, it's like, you can have a debate about pro-life and whatever, but like that to me is like, that's pro-life, right? That we need to make sure that we are giving kids every option to succeed. So when they get to school, they can learn, right? And they've got some basics to build on. I think there's a lot of, political and policy initiatives on that front that I'm not an expert on, but I know that that work's getting done. And I know there's a chat, so maybe later I can, get back and some links to folks. The first part of your question, repeat the first part of your question.
It was
Equity. It was about equity. Yeah. So I think there's a couple things here. So one is, again, and Dr. Underly, who's the state superintendent, says this a lot, is that we got to stop making schools and libraries the battlefield, right? So in her time as state superintendent, and I ran her campaign, so I was kind of involved in that process, and then I was on the transition, and then I kind of stepped away for a couple of years, and now I've returned in government service. There was this battle about trying to create CRT as an issue, which is like, that was all kind of nonsense. We've really tried to make the existence of trans children a battleground, which is really frustrating. There's now a big battle around book bans and like what books kids should have. I believe that parental engagement is super important, right? Parental rights shouldn't be seen as I can get books taken off the shelf of the library that other kids' parents then can't. It's just you with your child, and you don't want the kid to read that book, or you want to find out what your kid's reading, then you engage individually, but stop trying to promote policies that prevent other parents from making different choices. I read some, fairly violent and sexually explicit stuff as a young kid because I read everything, right? And I was reading adult novels and stuff like that. And my parents were aware of what I was reading. I remember one time I was reading a book that had a pretty explicit scene in it. My mother knew that was a book because it was in the house. I think it was something she'd read. And she didn't take that away from me. She said, I want you to be thoughtful about what you're reading. I mean, I was probably, 14 or 15 years old. And she confronted it with me, right? So like that to me is, and look, if other parents want to make a different parenting choice, that is obviously their right, but don't limit other people's choices. So we've had kind of battleground after battleground after battleground on these things that are actually disconnected from success. So to me, inclusion is about making sure that folks are able to access information, are able to be served. Kids should feel like they belong. I have a child who does not identify as the gender that, as the sex that they were born with. And gender affirming care saved that child's life. Absolutely saved that child's life. And that person is now thriving now, right? So I think that we have decided as a society, we're going to make this a political fight. I'm not saying let's win that political fight. I'm saying let's not have that political fight. That's the wrong political fight to have. And if we go back to corporate America, right, where there are a lot of Republicans, where there are a lot of conservatively minded people, right, where there are a lot of capitalists, that's great. I got no issue with any of that. Corporate America knows that inclusion is an economically successful strategy, right? We want every customer on access to the best workers. This isn't about giving people, an unfair kind of leg up or advantage. It's about letting everybody even have a chance at the table, right? And let's be honest, it is driven by a desire of politicians to exploit racism. That's what it's about. I don't even say that it is racism. It's like the people who are saying, let's use racism as a tool, right? I think a lot of you may have seen last week that this conservative person, this right-wing person, I shouldn't even say conservative because they're not conservative. This right-wing, far right said, well, if I see a black pilot, I'm going to have fear. And like in the reality of the world, what was happening before is black people didn't have access. Talented, smart, strong black people didn't have access to that system. So what equity and inclusion in creating opportunities for people has created is not less safety. It has created more safety because we're actually getting the best people. We're including everybody who might have those talents, right? Who might have the skills required to do those things. And that perversion of what inclusion is, I think in that battlefield, that political battlefield, is causing damage. It's causing damage in companies, it's causing damage in schools, it's causing damage in neighborhoods, it's causing damage in communities. And there are other things we can politically fight about. There are other things we can disagree about. I think disagreeing about tax rates is a very reasonable thing to do. I have very strong views about what tax rates should be. I understand when people feel differently, right? What is the level of public investment in things? That I understand why there are political differences on that. I don't know how we use children in schools as battlefields. I just think that that's not productive. And I think, again, I'd say that organizations like this, MMAC, Fuel, I think the members, the people out in the community who come from very diverse political views and background can help change that dynamic because, we want everyone to be successful. So
I have another question if we don't have one.
More, but go
Okay,
ahead.
no, I'll shut up. Go ahead. I'm going to chat. We can talk after.
What can we, as the average person, do to lobby against proposed legislation to expand seclusion and restraint as a disciplinary tool?
okay, that's really specific. So I'm gonna try to answer the first part of that, which is say, what can people do and how can people engage? And it could be about, corporal discipline and other, kind of harsh measures that the data tells us that those aren't successful. There's a proposal right now, I'll use one example, there's a proposal right now to, if you have more than 30 unexcused absences, this bill would say that you have to be held back. And sometimes that's the right answer. Sometimes that, not promoting someone, but one size fits all solutions rarely work. I know that, there's only, if the hat's not 7 1/4 or 7 3/8, it's not going to fit my hat, right? It's one size fits all doesn't work. So, the answer for how people can get engaged is I do think that people have their family and their personal life. People have their career. They got to make money so they can pay rent or the mortgage and, put gas in the car or whatever they got to do. And then they have to decide what their engagement is, right? And so I think there are an almost unlimited series of ways that people can get involved. So if that specific issue is something that person cares about, I think asking that question here, I don't know the answer right now of who's working on that, but we can go back into that chat. We can email that person. We can call that person. We can find out here's who's working on that. Here's how, they're going to give you a sample letter to send to legislators. They're going to help you figure out who your legislators are. They're going to tell you what that policy debate conversation is happening. They're going to help connect the dots for you. And so whether you care about that, or you care about nutrition, or you care about school funding, or you care about, this policy or that policy, somebody's probably already working on it. And if not, you can get the tool, you can learn the tools in advocacy training that a lot of organizations have to then figure out how to do that on your own. So I think it's the desire to make change that is really the critical thing. And then asking the question and then figuring out how to connect the dots. I don't actually know the answer to the question, right? Like, I don't know which organization is talking about the use of restraint in schools. I know somebody's talking about it, right? And I think just being willing to say, hey, I want to do something about this. I want to write a letter. I want to make a phone call. I want to go to a meeting. I want to bring it up at my PTA. I want to, bring it up at my local Rotary. I want to talk about it at church. All of those things are ways, and I'll say that at my church, people are doing this all the time, right? So like, there's the concerns of our common life, and people say there's letter writing about this in the reception hall after church day, right? That somebody has taken on those things. I think where society breaks down is when people don't engage, right? And there was this book, I don't know, 30 years ago or so, called Bowling Alone, that said, we had a lot of communal structure in American society, and formal and informal. And then as technology grew, as frankly, our economic status as a nation improved, we started to kind of isolate ourselves more, right? So instead of the village family, we talked about the nuclear family. Instead of, church as a central place, we, people kind of, view television or do the things, instead of a bowling league, they just said, okay, I'm going to go do this by myself. That's where Bowling Alone came from. And when I grew up, my first job was scoring in a bowling league. I literally took score. That was in New Berlin. So like, there was this communal kind of aspect to it. I think that, being very intentional about finding ways to be in community with others. And sometimes that's got to be virtual now. That's an option that's created. But turning that technology into a way for people to connect instead of to disconnect, I think is a really important piece of that.
I think that could be an interesting session for us to do with fuelers, just like that community engagement and advocacy piece, like how to, not what to do, but like how to do it when you're
Yep.
passionate about something, because I know a lot of people feel like if they write letters or they reach out, it doesn't make a difference. Nobody's gonna read this. It's not gonna, and that's just not true.
Is that true? You have your children's father was an elected official for a while, and I like what I'll say is the lower the level of government, the closer it is to the neighborhood, the more likely it is that one phone call or one letter or a small number will make a difference. Even today, right? Milwaukee County is almost 1 million people. If a county board member gets 10 calls on something, 10, they're like, holy shit, shoot. Somebody said that's just a real thing, right? Like, now, do US senators make choices that way? I mean, our US senator represents 5-6 million people here in the state. Like, you need to have a lot more, but they are paying attention, right? So it is a required collective action at that point. But it's not that, I will tell you, I am on a mission right now to change how the city permits parking on the street in my neighborhood. And I am one person and I am making a difference. This first about it. Yeah. It's not that I think you should actually even change the rules. It's literally the process to get the permit that's broken. It's not what the rules are that's broken. But it's all happened for rational reasons, but like one person can make a difference. Now, if we're talking about a state law, then it's not going to be one person. It's going to require collective action. And so that can make a difference. I saw a hand over here.
Many people associate with public instruction, public schools, of course, but can you also talk more about the role of the Department of Public Library?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it's like one of these things, right? Like they maybe should change the name of the thing. I tell people DPI or public instruction. They're like, what does that mean? I'm like, it's the State Department of Education. Okay, then that makes sense. So we are responsible for libraries to the extent there is a state agency responsible for libraries. We have a library consultant. There's some funding that's provided to the extent there are policy issues that need to be addressed. A lot of those things in libraries, in Wisconsin, a lot of things are locally controlled and locally funded, right? So for the most part, local communities fund their own libraries. They might get grants. They might get some state money. They might get some federal money. We have something called I think it's called the Common Fund, which the Board of Public Lands takes a certain revenue from the state's ownership of public lands and redistributes that to libraries. In terms of like what we do, again, I've been there 3 months, there's probably more that we do. I know one thing that the superintendent has spent some time on is just defending the freedom to read. That like, again, libraries have become a battleground, right? Like whether or not, so LGBT books are a great example. Like, so if there are young adult books or there are books that contain content that helps kids see, and I'm talking about kids specifically, LGBT content, especially as they get older, right? Middle school, high school. Most families, the data tells us most families want their kids to have access to that material. I want my kids to have access to that material. And I don't actually want my 17-year-old checking with me every time they want to read something. I actually think that's bad, right? Like I'm not going to be that controlling. The 10-year-old, I kind of want to know a little bit more, right? Like I want to have some sense, but I also want him to make his own choices and I want him to be exposed to things. There are some parents who don't want that for their children. But the fight that they've picked is they're saying they don't want that option for any children, right? Or they want to create bureaucracy where there's a policy proposal that like, if you make this request, then the library has to comply within this time period. And like, they're not staffed for funded to meet those levels of bureaucratic requirements, right? So I think parents should be able to see what their kids are reading. In Milwaukee, if my kid checks something out and it's on a child adult card, I can see it online. I don't need to go to the library or spend time. There's a technology that takes care of that. But that's not true with the 17-year-old, right? And that's about my relationship with the 17-year-old. And that kid is going to go to college next year, is going to be an adult, and I shouldn't have that, I mean, they have the right to some privacy and to figure things out on their own. And so I think defending that freedom, right, is something that we spend a lot of time on. It's just there's a bully pulpit, right, for an elected official to just say, hey, we're going to defend the freedom to read. We're going to defend the rights of parents to have their kids have access to stuff, and we want to promote parental engagement, but we don't want one set of parents to limit choices for other families, and that is a really tough thing that we're fighting right now.
This is one of those sessions where we had I think we did the mayor last year. We had a lot of questions in the chat afterwards that we couldn't get through to, and we just emailed them. So we'll probably do that in the case because we're right at 9:30. And so my last question as we wrap up this conversation, and thank you so much for
having me.
doing this. We always ask people if you could go back and talk to your 20-year-old self and give a little advice. What would you say to your 20-year-old self? Share that because it might be something all of us might benefit from.
I've been really lucky. So I think what I'd say is as you go through life, Sachin, I would talk to myself. I'd actually say Sachin because that's how you say it in Gujarati, but in English, it's Sachin. I would say don't feel stuck when you've made a decision. Don't be afraid to change your mind. I think that I've done some things in my life where I've stayed too long or I've stuck with a plan. And then eventually I've had to change my mind or abandon that direction. And I often left it too late. I left it too long, right? And so I'm dealing with that right now. Like I'm a business owner and I've got to make some choices about what direction I take. And I'm not making that decision, right? And it's like at some point you've just got to make the decision. You've got to decide this is the path, this is the investment, this is the energy, this is the strategy, and not try to get to perfect or not feel like you have to stick it out.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you should abandon things willy-nilly, right? But that definitely is something that I have, looking back over the last 30 years, I've probably stuck with some things longer than I should have. And then that's, other paths open up. I'm in a good place. I food on the table, gas in the truck, all that, but like not, there are things I might have done differently. So don't be afraid of change.
Don't be afraid of change. Sachin, is that how you say it?
That is, yeah.
That's what I'm calling
What my
you.
mother called me.
I always ask, what does your mother say? Because it's always different. Sachin.
There was a few different tones attached to that.
She's been out your last.
Chheda.
So she would just say
Chheda. But
Sachin.
you can hear the aspirated second H, which is not a separate syllable. So it's not Chheda and it's not Chheda, it's Chheda.
Yeah. but it's just
Very specific.
Sachin Chheda.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you, Corey. Go, Bill.